History as it happens, October 14th, 2021. How the U.S. got mired in the Middle East.
The American embassy in Tehran is in the hands of Muslim students tonight.
Iranian students continue to hold more than 50 hostages at the American embassy in Tehran.
We are now making arrangements for key naval and air facilities to be used by our forces in the region of Northeast Africa and the Persian Gulf.
As a free people, we've never allowed intimidation to stop us from doing what we know to be right.
Air attacks are underway against military targets in Iraq.
Today, I ordered American forces to strike Iraq. Our missiles sent the following message to Saddam Hussein.
These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
In 1990, there was one American military base in the Middle East, one in Bahrain. Today, there are dozens, and the origins of this imperium date to a decision made in 1983 to create CENTCOM, militarizing U.S. policy in a region where protecting the Persian Gulf's oil had become an imperative after the Islamic Revolution in 1979. But 2 decades of forever war have left the dream of military hegemony in tatters. That's next as we speak to Andrew Bacevich, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
We were geared up to fight in Europe. We were geared up to fight in Korea. We probably could have fought various and sundry other places, but the Middle East was on the back burner. All that changed in 1980, the creation of CENTCOM in 1983 being a very important symbol of how U.S. policy had become militarized.
What covers 21 countries, 4 million square miles, inhabited by more than 560 million people from 25 ethnic groups? The answer is CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, responsible for protecting American security interests, if you will, across the greater Middle East. Gotta cite my sources here. I took those figures from an article written in The Nation by our guest today, Andrew Bacevich.
And it was Reagan who created that in 1983, although he was replacing a pre-existing military command, which was the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force.
Our conversation with the president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft is coming up in a moment. Now, after listening to this episode, go online and find a map showing the location of all the U.S. military bases in the Middle East, and the world for that matter, and ask yourself, what would that look like if they were Chinese bases, or Russian, or, Saudi Arabian bases, dotting almost every portion of the globe? Absurd, right? Well, that is the point. And instead of bringing peace and stability to the greater Middle East, or even enhancing the American position there, CENTCOM has produced war, misery, folly. Now, CENTCOM's origins go back to the Carter administration. Jimmy Carter is often remembered as a weak president, but have you ever read his 1980 State of the Union address? Check it out. It's rather bellicose. It amounts to a declaration of war to anyone who messes with the Persian Gulf's oil supply. Now remember the context here: 2 oil shocks in the 1970s, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the hostage crisis, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interest of the United States of America.
What's so striking about Carter's address is how new the U.S. approach would be. Up to that point, the U.S., with a couple minor exceptions, had avoided sending its soldiers into the Middle East, for reasons that should be obvious to all of us by now. And as I mentioned at the top, by 1990 there was still only one American military base in the region. Our presence there, resented if not hated by so many of its inhabitants, was not yet prosaic. Andrew Bacevich is a historian and author of several books about U.S. foreign policy, most recently, After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed. We actually discussed his book in an episode published in July, and he is now the president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, a group trying to end endless wars. Andrew Bacevich, welcome back.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, a lot has happened since we last spoke in early July. The United States has finally withdrawn from Afghanistan, and that has led to a lot of discussion about how the United States got so mired in the Middle East to begin with, especially over the past 20 years. You wrote a piece in The Nation pointing to 1983, the year the Reagan administration established CENTCOM. So why there? Why 1983?
Well, I could have chosen 1980 just as easily. U.S. Central Command, as many of your listeners are going to understand, is the regional command. This is something that the United States does that I don't think anybody else on the planet does. Is the regional command that we say has responsibility for this vast area, incorporating the entire greater Middle East, from Egypt and Israel all the way out to Afghanistan. And it was Reagan who created that in 1983, although he was replacing a pre-existing military command, which was the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force that President Jimmy Carter had established. The Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force was really a way to implement the Carter Doctrine, a statement that President Carter made in his January 1980 State of the Union address, which declared that the Persian Gulf was a vital U.S. national security interest and a place that we were willing to fight for.
And such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force.
It was in response to that statement that U.S. policy in the region began to become militarized. I think probably 98% of our fellow citizens think that we've always had a major U.S. military commitment to the Persian Gulf. The fact of the matter is, prior to 1980, we had a negligible commitment. We weren't geared up to fight a war against Iraq or Iran or anybody else. We were geared up to fight in Europe. We were geared up to fight in Korea. We probably could have fought various and sundry other places, but the Middle East was on the back burner. All that changed in 1980, the creation of CENTCOM in 1983 being a very important symbol of how U.S. policy had become militarized.
Well, as of 1990, the U.S. had one military base in the Middle East, in Bahrain. I don't know what the number is today, but I know it's not one. There are many bases across this region of, 21 nations covered by CENTCOM. Something like 500 million people live there. And the U.S. has the ability to wage war anywhere in the region.
Mm-hmm. You make a good point. We could have said that the story begins in 1991. Well, what happened in 1990 was that Saddam Hussein, with whom we had had friendly relations during the 1980s, when Iraq and Iran were tangled up in a long war. But in 1990, Saddam invades Kuwait. 1991, George Herbert Walker Bush dispatches a major military effort to liberate Kuwait.
5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
And it's really that then which translates a military commitment that had been, in a sense, theoretical. It was a contingency, something people were thinking about. Beginning in 1991, it becomes a permanent military commitment. I mean, to your point, that's when these bases become a permanent part of the Pentagon's architecture, and when the use of force by the United States becomes routine. And I use that word routine quite intentionally. Again, what many Americans have forgotten is that although Desert Storm looked like a great victory, it was a victory in the sense that we liberated Kuwait. It was an imperfect victory in the sense that Saddam Hussein survived in power. And so Saddam became this nemesis, this danger that we had to tend to militarily all the time. So during the course of the 1990s, we're routinely bombing targets in Iraq, inflicting various punishments on Saddam Hussein, trying to keep him on his back foot, not trying to overthrow him at that particular time.
That's right, the no-fly zones.
The no-fly zones.
This will deny Saddam control of Iraqi airspace from the Kuwaiti border to the southern suburbs of Baghdad, and significantly restrict Iraq's ability to conduct offensive operations in the region.
But the point is that U.S. military action in a part of the world that basically there had been none now becomes routine. So routine, it's barely even noticed.
So let's draw a contrast between the current state of affairs, which is permanent war in the Middle East, and the start of U.S. involvement in that region, the post-World War II period, the Truman Doctrine, containment of communism, 1947, U.S. aid to Turkey and Greece to again contain communism, and U.S. support for Iran after the USSR left troops in Azerbaijan after World War II. But in both of these cases, or in all three of those cases, Turkey, Greece, Iran, there was no consideration from Truman and then into Eisenhower of actually sending U.S. troops, large numbers of U.S. troops, into the Middle East to deal with these problems. There was a Cold War context at work, right?
Yes. Now, we could cite the exception that proves the rule. And the exception that proves the rule was the U.S. intervention ordered by President Eisenhower in 1958 into Lebanon. A small contingent of U.S. forces, nobody gets shot, nobody gets killed. I don't remember how long they're on the ground, about 6 weeks.
And not long.
And they're out. That's the closest thing to military action in that part of the world until we get to the Carter Doctrine and its aftermath. Within that aftermath, of course, the creation of CENTCOM in 1983. So the centerpiece of U.S. national security policy in the 50s, 60s, 70s is the Cold War. The principal adversary is the Soviet Union. The ideological problem is the threat posed by communism. And that perspective then puts the Middle East very much on the periphery of U.S. concerns. It doesn't mean we ignored the Middle East. Obviously, we did not. I mean, the United States was very active as a diplomatic player, but as a place to go fight a war, didn't make any sense.
Eisenhower also okayed the toppling of Mohammad Mossadegh, which turned out to be a disastrous decision, again, in the name of containing communism, although Mossadegh was not a communist. So the Cold War is still on in the 1970s, but a couple of things happen in the 1970s, or many things happen in the 1970s, that draw the United States deeper into the region. They have to do with oil. We have the 1973 oil embargo after the 6-Day War in 1973?
It was the October War.
October War, thank you for correcting me. And then, of course, 1979, the shocks of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and another oil crisis. So this was a critical juncture because the United States decides it needs to defend the global supply of oil.
No question about it, because it appeared at the time, not simply to people like Jimmy Carter. Matter of fact, Carter himself probably had his doubts about this, but it appeared at the time that our prosperity was dependent upon access to Persian Gulf oil. And our prosperity is linked to our freedom. We think that prosperity is our birthright, inextricably connected to our conception of freedom. Even now, as you and I are speaking, we get all these news reports about, oh my God, there's disruptions in the supply chain and people may not be able to have access to toys they want to get for Christmas. And it's like a national crisis. So back at the end of the 1970s, when not simply Washington, but the American people more broadly discovered that the United States had a great interest in Persian Gulf oil.
Protecting oil was a priority, and it's around this time where the United States also starts picking sides in regional disputes. For instance, the AWAC sales to the Saudi Arabians. We backed Saudi Arabia versus Iran, Israel versus Hamas and Hezbollah. Talk about those developments a little bit and how that drew us even further in by choosing sides in these disputes that were of questionable importance to U.S. national security.
Why did we begin to choose sides? And I think the foremost answer is the Iranian Revolution. The revolution took away a U.S. ally. Whether the United States should have relied upon the Shah, whether they should have seen the Shah as an ally, is a somewhat different question. But we did. And so his overthrow came as a shock. The shock was compounded then by the hostage crisis, which caused great outrage among Americans. And in a sense, at the time, understandable. In retrospect, we might argue that the entire thing was overblown and mishandled. But I think that the Iranian Revolution played a critical factor in leading policymakers to reassess both U.S. interests in the region and the best way to satisfy those interests. When the Shah was in power, people thought that the best way to handle our interests was to outsource them. The Shah was going to be a stabilizing factor. Once he's gone, that seems to create a vacuum, and we fill the vacuum by sending in the U.S. military or preparing to send in the U.S. military.
And also something that can't be ignored, the amount of weaponry the United States is dumping into the region at this time. Obviously, during the 70s, the Shah got everything he wanted. Priority number one was giving him the top-of-the-line weaponry and air force. But also the United States backed Saddam during the Iran-Iraq War.
Right.
I mentioned the AWACS sales to the Saudis. The United States had always supported Israel. That's an important factor here too, right?
Well, I think here we see the pernicious influence of the military-industrial complex vividly on display. Because you're right, we sold, these are bought with oil money. We sold billions of dollars of weapons to the Shah. We have for decades now been selling billions of dollars of weapons to the Saudis and to others in the region. We don't sell to Israel. Israel has a special deal where we give them billions of dollars, what's like $3-point-something billion of weaponry per year. But I mean, whose interests are being served by all those weapons transfers? I think it's difficult to make the case those weapons transfers are contributing to the stability of the region. Matter of fact, I think it's probably just the opposite is true. But certainly, those weapons sales and transfers are contributing to the bottom line of General Dynamics and the other major weapons manufacturers.
Yet in 1983, after the Marine barracks was bombed in Beirut, Reagan pulled our forces out of Lebanon. So it seemed at that point our footprint was still small enough, maybe it was considered the wise thing to do, to leave when it becomes clear that our presence is resented, or to acknowledge that the risks of staying outweigh any possible benefit. What's your take on that 83 decision?
My take begins with an interpretation of that entire episode. Remember, it began with Israel invading Lebanon. The Israelis expected, I think really Ariel Sharon was the driving force behind this escapade, undertaken with the expectation that the Israelis would be able to install in Beirut a pro-Israel government, and that therefore any threat to Israel from its northern front, as it were, would be taken care of. That didn't happen. What the Israelis did was to unleash a civil war. And President Reagan, rather naively, I think, foolishly, naively, thought that inserting some U.S. Marines as peacekeepers would be able to create circumstances when some semblance of stability could be restored to Lebanon. The result was the Beirut bombing. I can't remember. I think it was 283 Marines, a couple of sailors killed. My sense is that Reagan himself was absolutely shocked. I thought I was bringing peace. And all I've done is to basically kill about half of a battalion of Marines to no purpose. The crude way of putting it would be to say he cut and run. I mean, he terminated this commitment, withdrew the U.S. Marines. I say cut and run, but I think it probably was a prudent decision, but was an indication, in a way, of what awaited the United States if it imagined that inserting U.S. forces into a complex situation could fix things.
What we do know is that the terrorists who planned and carried out this cynical and cowardly attack have failed in their purpose. They mistakenly believe that if they're cruel enough and violent enough, they will weaken American resolve and deter us from our effort to help build a lasting and secure peace in the Middle East.
If we get to his successor, George Herbert Walker Bush, we get in particular to George W. Bush, the idea is we're going to more forcibly insert U.S. forces in large numbers. We're really going to fix problems. We're going to make the bad guys go away. We're going to install new governments more to our liking, and that will bring stability. Well, it didn't. What it did was ended up setting us on the path that led to 9/11 and then more ill-advised wars.
Generally speaking, how did the people, not the governments who the United States was supporting, but how did the people of the Middle East respond to the development of CENTCOM being established in '83 and the growing U.S. military footprint in their backyard?
I'm not really capable of answering the question in the sense that I'm not a regional specialist. I'm sure that CENTCOM was welcomed by some, by the royal family in Saudi Arabia, for example, at least for a time, believed that U.S. military power could prop up the political situation in Saudi Arabia. But, and this is really far more relevant, there were some number of residents of the region who viewed the growing U.S. military presence as blasphemy, utterly objectionable, and justifying violent resistance.
Osama bin Laden was one of those people.
Yeah, Osama bin Laden would be example number one. So the U.S. military presence, again, undertaken with the expectation that, we have good intentions. We're not an empire, we think. We hope to bring about an improvement to people's lives, actually brought about instability, encouraged civil wars, other international conflicts.
Something I learned from reading Jeffrey Engel's book, When the World Seemed New, was that in 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the initial reaction by some members of the Bush administration, including Dick Cheney, the George H.W. Bush administration, was, well, so what if it's an Iraqi flag instead of a Kuwaiti flag on a barrel of oil? In other words, it wasn't an automatic that the United States would send in its military to expel Saddam. But Engel believes the administration eventually saw this as an opportunity for the New World Order to maintain a U.S. presence in this strategically important part of the world. So those concerns won out over any concerns about sending the U.S. military into this dispute. What do you make of that at least for a short time, there was some question about whether it was wise to expel Saddam from Kuwait?
The Iraqi invasion takes place in a very specific historical context. And the historical context is that the Cold War has just ended. And it appears President George Herbert Walker Bush, and I think many of those around him, not all, thought that the end of the Cold War did signal the opportunity to create what they called a New World Order. Now, they assumed that in the New World Order, the United States would call the shots. The New World Order would be one in which American primacy would be unquestioned. We had just gone from a bipolar world, as we called it, an oversimplification, from a bipolar world to a unipolar world. And here was this third-bit dictator, Saddam Hussein, presuming that he had the authority to make up his own rules. And I think that for Bush and people around him, that was intolerable. If Saddam could make his own rules by invading and annexing Kuwait, then why couldn't others? And given the fact that there was this expectation that after the Cold War, we would set the rules, it became necessary to demonstrate that Saddam was not going to be able to succeed in this. So the crisis of Kuwait in the late summer of 1980 did happen in a global context. And I think that probably influenced President Bush's response in a significant way.
As a friend of mine says, empires are addicted to the drug of control. Back to the oil issue, as you make clear in your piece in The Nation, the United States today is not nearly as dependent on Middle Eastern oil as it was in 1990. So it makes no sense to keep CENTCOM as it is. That's your point, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically. But all bureaucracies resist significant change. I think maybe military bureaucracies do more than any other type. Here we are 30 years after the end of the Cold War now.
And 20 after the invasion of Afghanistan.
I was going to make a point about NATO. NATO was created in order to defend Western Europe from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Cold War is long gone. But by God, Washington clings to the notion that the NATO alliance is absolutely critical to U.S. national security. I don't think that argument holds any water whatsoever, but it's an example of the way that there is resistance to questioning basic commitments and structures. Same thing applies in the Persian Gulf. the fact that we don't need the oil, the fact that we really ought to wean ourselves from oil, the fact that we're somewhere in a transition to a post-fossil fuel economy. Those are the big issues, I think. Doesn't cause people to have any second thoughts about the notion that, just like Jimmy Carter said back in 1980, Persian Gulf is a vital U.S. national security interest, and by God, we got to be ready to fight for it. And as long as that sort of unexamined logic prevails, then CENTCOM's going to last forever.
It would seem now is an opportunity to question the fundamentals because of the failure in Afghanistan.
I mean, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think the failure of U.S. policy in Afghanistan in and of itself provides ample reason to question the empire, to question the imperial project. On the other hand, cripes. I mean, our country is in the midst of multiple crises here. The pandemic, the economy, the divisions that we see in the partisan nature of our politics, problems such as the porous border, the reckoning with race. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Americans have a lot on their minds. The time doesn't invite, I think, serious scrutiny of our U.S. national security commitments, even though it would be appropriate to do so.
I think it was the day the U.S. pulled its final troops out of Afghanistan, or the day after, or the day before. The House Armed Services Committee, chaired by Democrats, because the Democrats control the House, actually added more money to the military budget than the Biden administration had requested. So that seems to me a sign that we're not quite there yet, questioning the fundamentals, the underpinnings that perpetuate this situation.
No question about it. President Biden, I mean, whose administration is in pretty serious trouble at the present moment, but nonetheless, President Biden has talked a lot about change in foreign policy. But I think what you just cited is an example of how, in a substantive sense, change ain't happening. I mean, if I was a betting man, I'd be betting on the Pentagon budget going up this year and going up next year. That has nothing to do with the actual national security interests of the country, has to do with the power of the military-industrial complex, has to do with what politicians think is politically expedient. You know, you win votes if you give more money to the Pentagon. If you question how much money goes to the Pentagon, you can put yourself in political jeopardy.
All under the illusion that this stuff makes us safer or it's better for the security of the world, despite all the evidence to the contrary. We question these cliches and they start to fall apart. Well, as I mentioned to a friend the other day, you know, a reference to the 800 or 900 bases the United States has. You know, imagine if China had a dispute with Mexico and sent its fleet into the Caribbean. We would think that's bonkers.
We would go nuts. We would absolutely go nuts. How dare they?
Thank you, Andrew Bacevich.
Oh, thanks a lot. It was a good conversation.
And you are always welcome here. Now, to our listeners, as I mentioned at the start, go online, find a map of U.S. military bases in the Middle East that shows how many troops are stationed at each one, and ask how much longer in a democracy can this be sustained. On the next episode of History as It Happens, there was once a time when many Americans bristled at the idea of sending our soldiers anywhere, a story intertwined with the history of the ROTC. The ROTC, whose origins date to the 1860s? Yep, and that's next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.